Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Deschutes River. This is Redbandia Outdoors. I'm Scott, fish biologist turned YouTuber, living the dream, being the star of my own fishing show on TV. Today's episode, we're going to talk about spawning gravel. We're not going to talk about the algae, the eggs, the fish so much, or the dam. We're going to talk about the gravel. What is spawning gravel? How does it get here in the river, and how does it move around? If you're interested in figuring that stuff out, learning about it, we got the show for you. We're going to start here with a little intro on the river. We're going to head back to the office where we're going to look at a suite of historical imagery of some of the islands and spawning gravel patches here on the river. And then we're going to conclude down on the river looking at some of the stuff that's formed over the last decade that fish use for spawning and rearing. So stick with me. But if you're new to the channel, this is the Deschutes River. It's one of the greatest gifts we have in our shared public resources portfolio. It's full of salmon, steelhead, redband trout, resident bull trout, and whitefish. It's an amazing fishery. It's very, very popular. And it flows through a desert canyon just east of the Cascade Mountains here in Oregon. It's about 100 miles long when it comes out of the hydroelectric complex, just a few miles upstream of me, and flows all the way downstream to the Columbia River, which then flows west to the Pacific Ocean. It's a very peculiar river. There's a book about it called A Peculiar River. And that's because it's got a very interesting hydrology. We're here in the desert where I'm standing right now, you probably get about an average of 8 inches of precipitation a year. And that's highly variable. And one of the greatest rain shadows on the continent of North America. We're up at Mount Hood where the smoke, you see the smoke coming off this fire here. I don't know if the sun's going to get you, but that line of smoke there, that's from the grasshopper fire. That's coming off of Mount Hood. So up at the Cascade crest, we're seeing close to 80 to 100 inches of precipitation a year. And then down here about 60 miles away at the canyon of the Deschutes River, we're seeing about 8. So a lot of this geology you see around here is very porous. It's fractured basalt, volcanic geology. And so when you look at a map, you don't really see the drainages, creeks and tributaries coming off the mountain range like you might see in, say, Idaho or Montana, where it's a more granitic, glacial derived geology, and the watersheds release their water, every 5-10 miles or closer. There's tributaries coming down. Here we have very few tributaries, a few from the west and a few from the east. And then, of course, the main river that comes down from Central Oregon in the High Cascade Lakes area through Bend, and then enters the hydroelectric complex here near Madras, and then flows down to the Columbia, like I said. So you can imagine from a spawning gravel standpoint, or at least from a gravel standpoint where it gets into the river and moves around, the Deschutes is very peculiar. We don't see a lot of spawning gravel movement, and we don't see a lot of addition of new spawning gravel because of this lack of high flows associated with the dam and the lack of tributaries that are pushing into our stream. Now, I've mentioned before in other videos, Trout Creek's a major spawning tributary for the Deschutes River on the east side. You can have quite a few, 500 to 1,000 spawners in there on a good wet cycle, years in a row where we have good water in the system, good runs coming back from the ocean. That moves a lot of gravel. I think it moves a lot of gravel in system. I don't think it's moving a lot of gravel out of that system down through several canyons and several depositional reaches to make it to the river and adding a lot of spawning gravel. So it's very peculiar out here. The flow is very stable. High flows are very much controlled by the dam system. You get downriver further by Maupin, where the White River comes in off of Mount Hood, where we can get rain on snow events in the wintertime. And get rain up on the glacier, we can have some massive flows coming out of the White River, and they influence the lower Deschutes. In particular, this year, I don't know exactly what the flow is, but we had some massive flows coming out of the White River. You can go to your Instagram and type in White River Falls and see people out there that were getting pictures of just tens of thousands of CFS coming down the White River, which is generally a non-anadromous river that comes off the glaciers of Mount Hood. It's very turbid water and enters the lower Deschutes River. I don't think that's pushing a whole lot of gravel out, at least spawning gravel. It's pushing a lot of fine sediment. So there's very limited opportunities where the Deschutes River is getting maintaining and managing spawning gravel, and I want to talk about that with you today. Let's head back to the office and look at some slides. All right, we've made it back to the office. Now let's talk about some of the more analytical pieces of this discussion. Let's look at some specific spawning gravel areas, how they came to be, and what's really influencing them. So the first slide, I've got 11 slides to go through here. This is where the real value of this discussion comes from. And I'm going to walk through them in a way to hopefully you guys can understand what I'm thinking and the points I'm trying to make. So right here, right now in front of us, I've got basically the current picture of what it looks like out there. And I want to kind of just align us to what we're going to be looking at. So you have a creek coming in here. You know, you have the big mill complex. This is all the tribal reservation. So you have the big industrial mill complex, and you have the creek that's wedged between it and the highway that heads off to Portland. And it kind of winds on through here. Of course, the Deschutes River, the bridge, the boat ramp that's above the bridge is just off the slide. And then you come down, you see the first, I don't know, half mile of river or so, and you see this island right here just adjacent to the mill. The creek and the island are the places I want you to really focus as I go through these slides. They're the main elements of the discussion. Don't get too caught up in looking at the jigs that are over here I'm working on. I'm trying to stock up the store with fish finder jigs. Those of you who haven't been to my channel before, this is the other thing I do is I sell hair jigs online or whatever. But they're right over here out of camera. Don't worry about them. You can check those out over at fishfinderjigs.com or check out this cool t-shirt, the chubby t-shirt that I got going on over there. But focus on that island in the creek as I roll through these slides. I'm going to have to do a little bit of clicking just to kind of move through there, but that was slide number 1. So on to number 2, one of the most important slides in the portfolio that I'm going to show you here kind of sets up the condition. This is all from Google Earth, where you can scroll back on the time clock. It goes back to 1985. The slide was so blurry I couldn't really use it for anything, but basically what you saw in 1985 was a tiny little bit of an island out here, tiny little bits of an island out there in the Deschutes River, and then the creek, again, as it looks in this, I've highlighted it with blue, it's pretty straight, right? That's what I'm trying to show you in this photo. In 1994, May 7th, the Deschutes River was where it is today. There's 2 really moderately sized islands, and the creek was pretty straight. Before that, back the photo before, you can look for yourself at 85. It's really tough to see any kind of detail making any sense of it, but you'll see like maybe 1, 2 small islands in that photo. So moving on, we're going to move up to, I believe it's 2000. Yeah, July 25th, 2000. I'm going to throw that one in there. Still in the black and white kind of series. The creek is still pretty straight, but the islands grew. They grew large in size. They doubled or tripled in size, both islands, and that's because of the 1996 flood. So take a good look at that. Everything's about the same. We see a pretty tight neck down Deschutes right here in the bend, and then a lot of material has accumulated on the islands, making them, like I said, at least double, if not triple, the size that they were before. I've tried to highlight all the gravel bar and line, the outside of that, so you can kind of get a real good picture of that. And so that's in 2000, July 25th, 2000. And so the next slides I believe I have up here is the high flow table. And so the high flow table is something I wanted to put in here. This is just from the gauge on Shatite Creek. That's the tributary stream. It's about 100 square mile watershed that drains from the spine of the Cascades all the way down through the Desert Canyon to the Deschutes. It's like the major tributary on the west side, right below the dam. And so when you pull the peak flows from the history of that gauge, there is some gaps, but this is what you see. There's some big gaps in the 80s, the 50s, and I'll fill those in a little bit, but this is what you see. You see 2 major floods. 1974, you see it at 2,300, and then 1996, 4,400. I think the real number there is about 3,400. I've done some calculations and work on that creek myself. I think the real number is 3,400 there, but either way, that is the flood of record at 3,400. The 96 flood, February 96. We'll get into this stuff a little bit more detail. Before that, it was 74. And then before that, it's not on this graph, was the 1964 flood. That's the one that filled the dam, right? So after 64, no big blast from the upper basin as far as flooding can go. 64 is the flood that actually filled the dam a lot faster than it was presumed that it might happen. And so the rest of the pink is just right dotted stuff that's like over 1,000, 1,200, nice flows that probably move some gravel and sediment or whatever over the years, and likely added to the fringes of that island, and just the fine sediment and the seeds and the smaller stuff that gets in there and really grows those islands. So there's a picture of that. If you guys want to pause it, I'll leave it up there for a little bit. But you can pull the peak flows off a USGS gauge. You just got to kind of click your way through the screens, pull off just the peak flow graph, and then you can kind of put it in Excel and make it look nicey nice, and see what's going on your watersheds. So that's the period of record peak flow. Let's switch over and kind of keep going through the slides. It's very important kind of to get to the point here. So back to the pictures, we're going to be looking at 2003, right? So 2003, islands really haven't grown too much. We haven't seen a ton of water come down. We've seen maybe one or two of those 1,000 events. And the creek's pretty straight, but it is starting to show a few bends in it. We'll watch that over time. We've upgraded, I guess, our satellite to a color one, or at least the one they share with the public. And the islands are still two distinct islands. I know a lot of you have been to this site and stopped through here when you fish. You stop at the island. So we're going to move up to 2011. So 2011, we're getting into the better satellite imagery. And now we can start talking things in a bit more detail. I put an arrow down here in the lower left-hand corner to show the creek. And you can see that the creek now has some pretty solid gravel bars in it. It's been moving some sediment, and when it gets down here to the river, which kind of sets the grade, trying to push all that sediment out. Now, when I'm talking about sediment, I'm talking about golf ball, maybe up to the size of a lemon or a little bit larger, and definitely everything smaller than that, down to a marble. That's all moving through the system, right? 125 millimeters in size. That's moving through the system, especially when that creek is a very straight fire hose, very powerful alignment. It's moving a lot of gravel. So as you saw in the previous photos, it had been doing that for quite some time. And now it's come all, and it's kind of packed up down here by the mouth, where it's struggling to get into the river, because the river is a constant flow and not grabbing it and pulling it away and allowing more to move in. Excuse me. And here in 2011 is when we first begin to see that. Gravel bars, or at least in the imagery that's provided to us. Gravel bars, starting to see some more of that sinuosity forming as the river has to cut through this gravel. It's all deposited after a high event. It needs to cut back through it. It does that moving upstream, and it cuts these windy bends in it. So that's a sign that sediment's been coming down. The islands, they're starting to pinch down. You can kind of see we have a side channel somewhat in the middle of the bottom one. And so in 2011, we start to get into the good imagery where we can really look at detail. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to jump up to 2019. I believe there's quite a few years, probably 3 or 4 in between you can look. But it all generally stays pretty stable, largely because of what I'm going to tell you here at the end, and how things generally progress in this system. So again, we're looking at the creek. Now it has 2 mouths. Looks like this is in April, so we've had maybe some fire or something like that, or some dead vegetation in there. You can see that the bends are getting even more tortuous, more sinuosity, tight bends in there as that gravel deposits, and the creek needs to work around them. And then so now it's a little bit more challenging, and I drew it in on the islands down here. Is the side channel is starting to kind of form, get pinched off a little bit, and then there's one more that goes through the island. But all those 1,000 flows or so, 1,000 CFS flows over the years are distributing enough smaller stuff, on the smaller gradation of that spawning gravel from the fines on up into kind of that marble size. And that stuff's moving down, and that island's catching it, right? You can tell that island's catching it because it's growing, and then you can see that outer bank on the mill side when you flow by there is nice and straight up and down. The river's carving into that a little bit. So let's move on from 2019. The creek has like a bifurcated mouth connection to the river. And so moving on up to the last aerial slide that we have to date on Google Earth, and that's 2014. This is the one that I started out with, kind of set the place for this discussion. And so you can see the creek there. It has a very, very tight meander bend at the mouth, comes right back around, wraps to the highway. You can see some of that gravel, but a lot of it, because it is still fairly stable, has revegetated over the last 10 years and has a grass willow cover over it, where some of these original bars I showed you, the one up, the second bar up and the first bar down by the mouth, those were gravel back in 2011. So those have revegetated, but we're seeing a very, very tight mouth. There's a lot of material in there. And then, of course, the island is the same thing. A lot of that stuff is vegetated back in. It's very challenging to see. There's a side channel still that splits them and another one down through the end. But that's the history of what things have looked like there. Now let's tie that in a little bit more with the hydrology and talk about what we're looking at. So that all those pictures there are stuff that you saw that was below a major tributary, Shatai Creek, right below the bridge, that's been putting in sediment for decades after the dam, right? The dam's been put in since 65 or 65 is functional or whatever, cut off the high flows. And so this spot I'm showing you right here, this is some of the stuff above the dam in the real short section above the highway, above the mouth of Shatai Creek, towards the dam where there isn't any tributaries and gravel hasn't been spitting out. And this is basic knowledge. All the scientists and managers working on the river, they understand this, right? There's a lot of sediment reports on the Deschutes over the years. You can go to the PGE website. I'll put a couple links in the description down below where you guys can go look at documents or whatever, or brochure handouts on the gravel studies that have been going on. PGE's been tagging rocks so they know where they move, and going back with very high-scale GPS and aerial photography, monitoring these sites, looking at fish use, spawning on top of some of these sites. And so this is one of the sites above the dam that has not been getting natural gravel additions from a creek mouth for a long time. And you can see just by looking at it, if you kind of erase your mind from the logs that have been placed there, to add habitat, mitigate for issues with the dam, you can see that definitely looks like a shrinking island, right? It doesn't look like the ones that we saw below Shatai Creek, where sediment of all different types and sizes was coming out over the years. Some years the big stuff kind of puked on out, made the island, and then after that the fine stuff came through and the brush took over. This one looks very different. You can see the immense spawning that occurs around it in all the dunes. The dunes that the salmon, the fall chinook dig in there, and then the redband and steelhead spawn in that stuff, the same gravel, different time of year. But you can see the dunes, and you can look across the river on the other side, on the tribal side of those islands. And again, those islands also look like islands that are shrinking, not growing. You don't see a lot of the fine sediment and things like that. So that's one of the issues with the dam, is all the sediment that comes down, regardless of the temperature and the flow issues with the algae and so on and so forth. There's a sediment, issue, which includes spawning gravel and everything finer than that builds islands and keeps that kind of habitat alive on the river. And so I think you can clearly see that here. The logs have been added as part of the mitigation effort with the new license you've heard me talk about in my other videos. And so those two things are kind of playing at hand into what's going to potentially, or what's been being done to mitigate for this, is we're adding some wood, and we've also added some gravel with mechanical means where we can. They've added, I think, 600 yards or something like that to a bunch of spawning sites and been monitoring it, right? Because from what I showed you, below the creek, gravel's coming out naturally, but up above, there's a lot of issues with no new supplementation of gravel. So we're doing that mechanically with contractor construction equipment, putting in the gravel, monitoring it. That stuff will be in the brochures. So as you get to the next slide where we talk about the climatology, like how does this all work? How does this all work? How did the Deschutes get its gravel over time before before the dam was there. And so let's talk about flows and rivers in, La Nina, El Nino. We're here in a major wildfire event, and everyone talks about, climate change and this and that. And so when we break that down, it gets into the La Nina, El Nino, right? So La Nina is the warm and wet, and El Nino is the warm and dry. And so generally speaking, that's what plays out here in the Northwest, is a wetter pattern that's generally warmer. And then when El Nino happens, it really dries out around here. Moisture goes to the south, and we stay dry, and it's still a bit warmer. And so in 1964, that was when the flood came that filled the dam, right? So that was the last time that we were going to get a big old juicy shot of gravel from the upper basin, because there was a dam complex going in. And in 1964, we had basically, which was the flood of record at that time, across Oregon. We had a big one here in the Deschutes. It filled the dam sooner than we expected, and it didn't, obviously push out that gravel onto that island I just showed you. In 74, and that was a weak La Nina year, right? So warm and wet, weak La Nina. Generally what we see is rain on snow. We get a few storms that are cooler. We get some snow down in our lower elevations, mid elevations, and then it really warms up and you get rain all the way to the top of the mountains and it blows it all out. Those are the ones that move the gravel in this system. In 74, it was a real strong La Nina. That was the 2300 you saw on the graphic before. That's the second highest peak flow in Chautauqua Creek. That one definitely started the islands that we saw below the bridge, right? By the 1984 photography, or 1985 on Google Earth, which I said was blurry, you can see the islands there. It's most likely, boom, that big La Nina push. It was a flood of record at that point. No, it's one of the strongest La Ninas that we have on record up until that point. Was 1973-74 winter. Coincided with a 2300 CFS flow out of Chautauqua Creek. Started the Mill Island complex is what I might call it. And so then you get to 1997. The winter of 1996-97, February 1997, Chautauqua Creek flood of record. On the graphic, it says 4,400, but when you go and take out some of the weird observations in there, the back calculation of the stage height, how high the water got, it comes out to be about 3,400, which is still a giant flood. And as you saw, that substantially increased those islands. So one last slide talking about the climatology, which is important here, is kind of that difference between the La Nina, El Nino story. And so this year here in the Northwest, or anywhere for that matter in the U.S., you're seeing that graphic always come up in the news, which is that super El Nino, that extremely warm water graphic they show out there in the Pacific Ocean and how it butts up against the west coast of North America, Central America, and South America. And this year it's super hot. It's way hotter than it was last year, and it's way hotter than it's ever been. And so that they're calling that a super El Nino, right? We're expected to be extremely dry and warm here in the West, in this part of the West. So 1996, completely the opposite, right? Completely the opposite of that. It was a super strong La Nina. So 1998, the dry year, that's what's being used to compare to our current year right now. And so the data shows that it's similar, but not as strong. And then so the winter just before that one, 96, 97, that was when we had the flood of record, right? And that's when the islands formed. And so we don't have enough data to say that the gravel moves in strong La Nina events, on the Deschutes River. But what we do know is that when gravel moves, we have big flows. And so what you saw in the creek is the creek's getting very sinuous down there, trying to cut through all that gravel that's come down through that fire hose section over years and hit the river. And so we're ready and waiting for another big high flow event to push a lot of that back out into the river and see what happens to that island. So right now we're going to jump out in the river. Hopefully it's not too smoky. We're going to wait a little bit till here after dinner. Jump down the river and go check out that island, show you those side channels, see what good habitat looks like. See you down there. All right, everyone, we're back on the river. We're floating down now towards the bridge. So I wanted to jump in here because I'm going to try and use the GoPro and show you as we flow past the creek mouth underwater a little bit, hopefully if the sun's bright enough, and then down through the next hole before the island where a bunch of the spawning gravel settles out and makes a big tail out of spawning gravel there. So I wanted to jump in here, wanted to let you know we're down at the river. Sorry about the truck noise. We're going to do a quick float, get down there on the island. We're going to look a little bit at the habitat and some of the stuff that I talked about in the video. See you down there. All right, we've made it down to the river this evening. We got a shuttle after dinner. I want to show you some of this habitat down on the downstream end of this island where the two islands sealed up together. Now what you usually see in these type of environments, even at your riffles, where you got the head of a riffle on a point bar, like those big meander bends I showed you in the creek. You see this on the island too, the tip of the island. That's where all the energy hits the island when we have these big pushes of sediment, high flows, sediment or otherwise. So you'll see a lot of coarse material up there. The bigger cobbles and gravels, the stuff that's immobile, makes a great riffle for fish to kind of tuck in. I know you fly fished kind of that first little turn in the riffle. Everyone likes that. But as you move down on these islands on both sides, especially on this one, what you see is a tremendous amount of that small material. Hopefully you can see that here. I'll try to pick some up. But it's this type of material right here that we see down on the downstream end of this island, and lots of it. So when the flow's up a little bit higher in the spring, or those years when the flow's higher, and this has got some depth in it, maybe up to your shin or so, this whole area is covered with red band reds. You can see kind of the little dips in the bed here, some of those dunes that are forming, and then you can see down there into the corner, just down there, right about there where my finger is, that's where that side channel forms. I just went down there and took some video with the GoPro in there underwater. Super cool dark side channel, all kinds of juvenile fish darting around, and that's where this island is super sweet habitat, 'cause it still cuts through and cuts down and makes like a bifurcating side channel. It's full of hundreds of juvenile fish of all species. So this is an amazing thing that we see, you can come and look at here on the river to understand some of the ecology of the Deschutes and how it works. Where if you go to the upper islands, you don't see all this fine material. It's not coming down. It's basically spawning gravel with no fine material holding it all together. It's great spawning habitat, but what's the future? This island is alive. It's evolving. At some point, it's going to change. There's going to be a big another pulse of sediment that's going to come out of the creek at some point, like I talked to you guys about in the slideshow portion of this. And it's going to form some cool habitat. And this goes all the way around. And the same thing on the other side. The fast channel at the top is all coarse material. It's almost like a little class 1 rapid right at the top. And then as you come down, it broadens out. It's spawning material from side to side, waiting in that channel in the springtime through the early summer. You're definitely going to be stepping on some eggs. There's probably some fish spawning over there now, even later in the summer in this back corner where the gravels are really good. But I'm going to finish up the video with a little bit more GoPro down there on the back end of that side channel. Maybe I'll play it with the jingle, who knows. But I like to see you out there in the river. Don't ever give up on the Deschutes. It's one of the most amazing pieces of real estate we have in our country. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.